I'm John Kirkwood, and, this is Notes from the Wilderness. This episode is a hard one for me because I didn't live it, and most of the time I'm talking to you, it's from experience. The only experience I have with this episode is from hearing the pain of others who've lived through it. So, purity rings, virginity pledges, chewed gum, and crumpled rose metaphors. If you grew up evangelical, you probably remember some of these things from youth group or the rules of purity culture that were instilled by your family dynamic. But in this episode of Sacred Scars, Healing Beyond Belief, we'll talk about how purity culture taught us that sexuality was something to fear, how shame was baked into our bodies, and how those teachings warped marriages. It warped gender roles, and it damaged self-worth. Then we'll look at how healing begins. So grab a coffee. Now, I have to be honest with you, I never led a youth group, and my experience in a youth group is prior to the rise of this purity culture stuff. So basically, it was just an excuse for parents to get rid of their kids for an hour or two a week. And we'd gather together and we'd have, pizza and cheap pizza and pop or soda, depending on where you are, from what state you live in. And then there'd be, some games, and there'd be, a light talk about salvation or what have you. But I didn't attend youth group during the whole rise of purity culture, and I can imagine just how difficult that was, because it really it was like a raging fire. It really, Joshua Harris wrote a book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and then that became pushed by different Christian radio and Christian ministries, and basically it became peer pressure. If you weren't altering to letting your children date, to courtship, and following all these rules and making pledges with purity virgin cards and special rings and this kind of thing, and exacting the idea of courtship and not dating, you weren't a good Christian. And that's the kind of peer pressure not only that affected our children, right, young men and women growing up in this culture, but it affected parents too, and parents went along with it, like we tend to do when we're in tribes, right? We want to we want to signal to the tribe that we're loyal, that we're faithful, that we're a good member, a member in good standing. And so youth groups would start to focus on this. There would be purity talks, and as we mentioned, those metaphors. If you think about these metaphors too, they're all kind of pointing, or they're all hanging like the sword of Damocles over young women. And really, there was pressure from purity culture on both boys and girls, young adults. But really, this focus was on women, because the chewed gum metaphor was about a young girl, right? Or a girl who hadn't been pure. and you've lost your flavor. You've lost something, right? A chewed piece of gum is worthless. Sometimes the idea of a used Kleenex was used as a metaphor. Sometimes, as our YouTube thumbnail, a wilted rose, a cut flower that has wilted and is losing vibrance and maybe has shed a few petals, and you can't put those petals back. You can't go back, right? So these were metaphors, a crumpled piece of paper. I know I love reading C.S. Lewis, but C.S. Lewis talked about it as an empty, you don't keep around an empty, this is cool. I got to show you this. When you're done with a pack of cigarettes, when you've smoked all your cigarettes, you don't keep the package around, right? You throw it away because it's worthless, except for this one, because this is the brand that C.S. Lewis smoked. And they were rather small. I mean, look how small these are. These Players Navy cut medium cigarettes from the 60s in the UK. So they were small back then, but when you finished them, you normally threw them out. I'm glad this person didn't throw them out because I bought it on eBay to inspire me when I write. It's a long story. But anyway, these are the metaphors. These metaphors were all kind of pointing at girls, And never was it taken into account during these youth group sessions or these books or these seminars that possibly we were dealing with some girls who have had sex before marriage. Or it might not have even gone that far. They might have just, rounded a few bases, and still the culture that was now supposed to protect us from shame just manufactured more shame for our children to go through. Now, granted, they've been hearing since the time they were in diapers that they were totally depraved, right? So you have the total depravity of evangelicalism coming into perspective, that we're all hell-bound, hell-deserving, garbage for the dump. And now we get to puberty and we get this extra heap, a second scoop of shame and guilt for our kids to carry around and have to sit on counselors or therapists' couches now and spend countless hours and thousands of dollars to overcome the very thing that was supposed to give them a better life, right? A fruitful life, or something deeper, a grander life. So this is what purity culture was. If you were there, you can probably still feel this shame in your body. There were true love waits rallies. Remember those? There were rings, purity rings. There were pledges made. There were slogans. Modest is hottest. Again, this is all directed at young women, right? Sex was framed as something dangerous, and it was only holy if postponed until marriage. So this was the theology that was shared. This was the theology that was platformed and celebrated from pulpit to dinner table. And virginity became equated with holiness, but not just holiness, also worth, self-worth. Because who wants to keep around a used Kleenex? It's kind of ridiculous, right? Marriage was posited as the only safe container for intimacy. And this became a combustible situation now. So you have young people going through puberty and they have these desires that are new and strange, and their body is changing. And so there's a lot of stress. There's already a built-up pressure to all that, and they're dealing with all that, and they have new desires and new appetites, and they don't know how to deal with that. And this is what they're told. that those desires are sinful. And yet, if you have those desires, say the Apostle Paul, then you really should get married. And so this was the combustible situation that we were foisting on our children. And with verses like 1 Corinthians 6:18 and Matthew 5:28, they were taught about this idea of fornication and so forth. And it was like the third rail. And contrast those passages with the Song of Songs, and how desire is celebrated or the Song of Solomon, if you have a King James. There were different things posited, as the Bible is kind of contradictory in areas, but girls were taught that their whole worth meant virginity and modesty. And the funny thing is, there were girls who dressed modestly who weren't virgins. They were good play actors, and they knew how to play the game. And then there were girls who didn't dress modestly who were virgins, but they were treated like they weren't. This is the world. So hypocrisy was already being taught. Judgment was already being taught to our youngest, to our kids growing up, and to our young parents. This is the way you should parent. This is the ideas that we should implant, and our kids were burdened with these modesty rules, but boys were blamed for lust. I mean, this didn't just affect young women. It affected them to a stronger degree, I would suggest. I mean, really, the sights were really pointed at young women, but it also affected young men. They were told that the chemical reactions that were going off in their body now had a sinful component, So their desire made them animals. They were shamed for arousal, of course, for porn or for masturbation. And both internalized, our young boys and young girls, our children, both internalized these messages that they received. Women were stumbling blocks, right? Young women, and men seen as predators. So purity culture didn't protect boys and girls equally. It just shamed them differently. This is what it did. So what of the fallout from all this, besides even more teen angst, which probably led to some good things? I mean, it gave us the grunge movement music. Teen anxiety has really been a great inspiration for rock and roll. Sorry, for art. And yet we don't want our kids to have scars to make that art. All right. So what is the fallout of all this? Well, a lot of the fallout was early marriages. I still see this happening. You thought you moved beyond purity culture. I see young kids who don't even have jobs, who don't have homes, hurrying into marriage. And a lot of it is from what they're hearing at church. I'll share one thing for you all to hear, and it's a famous passage from Paul. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 7, "But I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them to remain as I am, to remain celibate." And then this verse, which has been weaponized, "But if they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with desire." All right, I want you to think of this as a father of a daughter. Okay? You're the father of a daughter, and you believe that the Bible is God's word, and it's inerrant, and it's infallible, and you can't challenge it, and it's perfect wisdom, it's divine wisdom from God. And you read something like this verse, "But if they don't have self-control," this is pointed mostly at young boys, right? Because it was considered that boys have this burning desire. They have testosterone, they have more chemical leniency or trajectory towards satisfying these desires than maybe young girls do. But, it affects both. If they do not have self-control, let them marry. Does that sound like good advice to you as a father or as a mother? Oh, this young man, he doesn't have any self-control, so I'll just let him marry my daughter. It's better that they're married than that they can't contain their desires. Does that sound like something you look for in a son-in-law? Oh, tell me, Dad, how did this wedding come about? Well, I determined that young Jacko here didn't have any self-control, and I didn't want it to end up in the back of it won't be, what was 60 Chevy? Was that the car in Night Moves? Back at the 60 Chevy, or pick any song you want. It doesn't have to be Night Moves. It could be Jack and Diane. I just saw that Mellencamp played Farm Aid last night. But if they don't have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with desire. Does that sound like good grounds for young people to marry? The lack of self-control. They're just too damn horny. So let's get these kids down an aisle. I'm sorry, but there's certain passages I've marked in. Paul had a bizarre view of sexuality. It was primitive. It was Greek. It was primal. And we mistake it for being divine. But this was written by a guy who thought that women should keep their hair covered because angels might get horny. Forgive me, my wife's going to cringe that I'm using this language, but it's true. Paul perpetuated the Greek idea that a woman's hair was part of her sexual productive system. And that's why, by the way, in the Greek culture, prostitutes would cut their hair because they thought they'd be less likely to get pregnant. I'll let you look into that, but Paul believed that. And so he thought a woman should keep her hair covered because angels, might not be able to control their lust. And they might want to Genesis 6 this whole thing all over again. And of course, our purity culture might have put rings on our daughters, but did it really put head coverings? I mean, how serious were you about living God's word, Dad? Yeah, we live a contradiction, don't we? So this verse, but if they don't have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with desire. So what happened? What do you think happened? What would happen when we're teaching our kids this? They're going to get married. They're going to take the fact that they have these desires, their new desires, their strong desires. And they might be dating at the time, or they might find people attractive in their youth group, and they might say, wow, it's the right thing to do. I need to do the right thing. Young man, what are your intentions with my daughter? Well, I want a quarter. And they really wanted to hurry to the aisle, to walk the aisle, because they had emotions and feelings and desires that they were having a hard time controlling. And they were told that there was only one avenue that was acceptable. And that avenue was holy matrimony. And it led to a lot of early marriages. And so what happens? How does this affect boys and girls differently? Well, remember, girls are seen as temptresses or stumbling blocks, right? And girls under this system were responsible for boys' thoughts. Can you imagine that? And this whole idea, this horrifying idea that if a girl is sexually assaulted or something, that she bears part of the responsibility, because after all, she was wearing heels or a miniskirt or something. And, well, you know what that does to Junior. So girls had this extra burden where they were responsible for boys' thoughts, And so dress codes and modesty talks and cover your shoulders. Their worth was tied to their virginity. And boys, well, lust-driven animals. That was just accepted. Of course, they don't have self-control. And boys were kind of looked at as not having to have self-control. I mean, it was just a part of the way, things were, the way things were shaped. And so they were simultaneously told that their future wives would be their outlet for their desires, for their arousal, or even their porn use. So they grew up, boys and girls grew up with these cycles of guilt. But boys especially grew up with guilt and confession, right? They might have a mission in their sleep and think it's sinful and not just a bodily response to a progression of puberty. And they felt guilty over it, and they'd confess it. And they were born and raised believing that they were totally depraved animals. It shamed them. It shamed them differently because they grew up believing that their desire was sinful. So purity culture didn't protect boys and girls equally. It shamed them differently. And this led to early marriages and divorce. It is better to marry than to burn with passion. So many rushed into marriage. And you know what happens when young people rush into marriage and they're not prepared. They're not financially prepared, but they're not emotionally prepared or psychologically prepared. A lot of them are selfish, and they haven't matured enough to take on that kind of responsibility and that kind of commitment to one another. So they jump the whole process. Remember, because they're skipping dating and going right into courtship. And they're trying to get right into the marriage bed. That's really the desire. So purity culture kind of pushed this. And many rushed into marriage too young, believing it was the only holy way to be sexual. So a lot of people who got married young, and the percentages of those marriages that failed. Immature relationships led to unhealthy dynamics, led to high divorce rates or lifelong dysfunction, which added more shame in an evangelical room. I was talking to my son about how morality has changed in evangelicalism. But when I was growing up, not when Connor was, but when I was growing up, divorce was, to evangelicalism what transgenderism is today, right? That was the bozo no. That was the real, oh my God, so-and-so is divorced. Can you believe it? Oh, he can't lead the choir. She can't teach a Sunday school class. Many divorced people didn't even go to church. They were so ostracized. So that level of guilt isn't as strong as it was when I was growing up in the 70s, but it's still there. You still feel like you failed. You failed God, you failed family, you failed church, you failed your spouse. And heaven hope you didn't have children, but you failed them as well if you've had children, if you've gone through divorce. And these were needless divorces because they were needless marriages, because they were children who weren't ready, but whose whole system, whose whole tribe said this is how it's done, So, and then what was the aftermath of this? Well, purity culture flowed seamlessly into complementarianism. This idea, or you might have heard it as the word submission. Wives, submit to your husbands as the church unto the Lord, right? And so it's patriarchy. But patriarchy often leads to misogyny, because basically that's kind of baked in. And so you had this idea of husband as leader and the wife as submissive, and then you have verses in the Bible taught by Paul that once women were married, they must always be sexually available. Always, 99% of the time, unless they, of course, they're fasting and praying, or, that once a month time. That, yeah, they should abstain. So, I mean, I know a lot of women who probably wanted to be fasting and praying and wanted to become nuns after they were married, because they were married to so husbands here were permissioned as entitled, right? Wives as obligated. And these are young people. They haven't lived yet. They haven't grown. They have no understanding, very little understanding of what things would be like. And they're thrown into this. Forgive me, I'm about to sneeze. So purity culture didn't end at the wedding altar. It just changed its name to complementarianism or submission. And you have now this dynamic. And this dynamic, by the way, it's brought about again they keep showing these Charlie Kirk clips where he's telling women in Oxford who are studying in different fields that they should really just be married and raise kids. And that this idea that women are more unhappy now because they aren't just breeders is very evangelical. It's that patriarchy lives, and it's popular again. But the gender divide has consequences, and it wasn't just about individual shame, but a system that created a lasting inequality. So, and all this led to divorce. Early divorce. And so what does it mean? From purity to submission, and from submission to harm, right? I mean, it's been harm all the way along, but it's just been adding up. And so you have the writer of I Kissed Dating Goodbye, Joshua Harris, now condemning his book because he's heard from thousands and thousands of people who applied his book and who lived his book, and it destroyed their lives. And I'm saying this as somebody who also pivoted away from bad theology. He did the right thing. He did the responsible thing. He pivoted and he said, this book should not be sold anymore, and I repent of it, and I reject it, and I see how much harm it has caused. And he himself has gone through a divorce because he himself had gotten married young. And his wife, by the way, has written a wonderful book. Very painful to read because she describes the harm she went through as a young woman who was living through this purity culture. And as a pastor's wife, and how awful it was that she lost her identity. She lost her personhood. And she lived for years like in somebody else's life. And how divorce has actually been a blessing to her. So I do recommend her book. But the harm it's caused is that sexual shame is lodged in body memory. And so how do we heal from this? The first step is to recognize that shame is false. That shame was not earned. It was foisted upon you, along with the guilt that led to the shame. So naming the shame as false is really that first step to healing from this harm. Well, the harm also led to an inability to connect intimacy with joy. So many young Christian women or evangelical women still harbor those feelings because it was pounded into their head that sex is naughty. And that intimacy is shameful. And they live with this. They still grapple with this, and their husbands grapple with this. It's a shared trauma response. And it's very similar to a trauma response of a girl who has been sexually assaulted, and the overcoming it psychologically and through therapy is a similar path. And I'm not trying to say they're equal. Please, if you've been a victim of sexual abuse, I am not saying they're equal. But I am saying some of the fallout is the same. Some, not all. So men and women are both wounded by these distorted expectations. The men that marriage is going to solve everything, right? And then they all of a sudden get into a marriage and there's all kinds of other challenges that arise that they had never planned for, have never even thought of. And this generational trauma is passed down through silence and shame because we don't want to talk about it. But you know what? There's been dozens now of documentaries made about this purity movement and about evangelical sexual dynamics that are important for us to watch and see that you weren't the only ones who lived through this. And you're a survivor, but there are pathways to healing. There's some still trying to carry this movement forward. I don't know if you've seen the Duggar documentaries of some of the Duggar children who've escaped, and they talk about their upbringing and how harmful it's been. So men and women are both wounded by distorted expectations, and their generational trauma is passed down. And it carries with it silence and shame. So begin by naming this shame as false. That's where it all begins. And put it in your journal. Share it with yourself. Therapy is an option, and it's a strong option, and it's a necessary option in many cases. Somatic healing or trauma-informed approaches to healing. Reclaiming your sexuality as good, as joyful and sacred, and throwing away those metaphors, heaping them on a fire. The metaphor of the chewed gum, of the wilted rose, of the crumpled paper, of the empty cigarette box. And seeing your body as an ally, not as an enemy. This is an important one for young men as well as young women. Because you've been taught as a young man that your bodies, those feelings you have, they're foreign, they're not natural, or they're sinful, or they're of the devil. Your worth, and this I'm saying to young ladies, and forgive me if it comes out as kind of crass, but I need you to know, if you're healing from this, that your worth was never between your legs. Your body is not the enemy. And if it helps you, jot these things down. Include them in your prayers. Keep them in your letter, in your journal to your former self. The body's not the enemy. My worth was never between my legs. And although they promised us purity would save us, they promised us that purity would save us from shame, protect our innocence. All it did was give us more shame. And it sacrificed our innocence. So keep these things in mind. Some of those documentaries might help you heal because they let you know that you're not alone. They also let you know that there are other resources out there that you can mine, that you can sample. The Purity Myth by Jessica Valenti was a documentary that digs into how abstinence-only education and purity rings and the virginity ideal affect young people, but especially girls, and how it reinforced double standards. So that's one, the Purity Myth. You could jot these down. There's another one called For Our Daughters, When Womanhood is Defined by Submission to Men. It's based on a book, but it's a film from last year that looks how Christian purity culture pushes female submission and modesty, framing women's worth around sexual behavior and gender roles. Now listen, if you're a parent who lived through this, you have your own sense of guilt and shame. It's different from the children that you raised, but you have your own sense of guilt and shame that you were responsive to this to the peer pressure of your peer group, of your faith practice, that you did bring to your children thinking it was the right way, thinking it was good for them, like brushing their teeth or like getting them a good education. There's room here that you need to give yourself grace and space, and you need to forgive yourself, but you also need to reach out to your children and ask them for forgiveness. You also need to state that the shame that they carry, in a sense, you carry as well, because you love them and they're your children, and you thought you meant well at the time, and you thought it would lead to a better life, and you realize now that you were wrong and you're sorry. This is necessary for you to heal as a parent. It's absolutely necessary that you have this conversation. Now, this conversation, depending on the dynamic you have with your children, maybe you're estranged from them because of some of this, or maybe you still have a relationship with them. So maybe you could jump in a car and say, let's go get a Starbucks, and you could have this conversation in the car. My father and I used to do that. I used to love it. Now, there's certain situations, I need to tell you that there's certain dynamics that help with this kind of conversations. And one of them, you're going to laugh, there's two situations that really work well. Sitting in a car and sitting at a bar. Ouch, that rhymed. That was Dr. Seussian. Now, listen, maybe you don't drink, so it doesn't have to be a bar. It could be a diner, but as long as you have some privacy. But there's something about sitting next to each other. There's something about being able to share difficult things where you're not looking at each other eye to eye. Now, there's some conversations that must be eye to eye. When you're talking to your lover, some conversations need to be face to face, eye to eye, but there are some conversations that are easier to at least begin when you're sitting next to each other. So my father and I, whenever I had a heavy burden that I needed to share with my father, when I was looking for advice, we'd jump in the car. And we didn't understand the dynamic. Maybe he did. I didn't at the time until I read it from a psychologist years later. I didn't understand the dynamic until years later. And what made it easier for me to share things was the fact that we were both looking at the road, and that I could share things much easier when he wasn't looking right into my eyes. So I don't know, maybe that dynamic is in a car ride for you, or sitting down at a bar having this conversation, even if the bar's in your own home. Or maybe it's with a letter. If you're estranged from your children, they don't pick up your phone calls, they don't answer your texts, maybe it begins with a letter. And maybe that letter is never answered. Okay, you apologized, you got it out, you asked for forgiveness, you expressed your sorrow that you were complicit in something that harmed your children. In the same way that maybe you thought there was a food, a food thing that was healthy for them that you now realize wasn't healthy for them. Asbestos at one time was asbestos is really good at what it does, whether it's insulation or other things, and yet it's harmful to human beings. So we didn't know it at the time. And some of the theology we shared with our children and raised our family with is asbestos. And how do you deal with asbestos? Yeah, you gotta put the gloves on and the mask on, or have somebody certified who knows how to deal with it come in be a third-party helper, but you have to listen. I know that the guilt and shame being carried by the purity culture isn't just on the young people who grew up in it, but it's also on the parents and the spiritual leaders. If you're a youth group leader, yeah, write a letter to all your former youth group, even if it's a general letter. Look what Joshua Harris did. Follow what Joshua Harris did. When you know the courage it took to come out and say this bestseller book that made me hundreds of thousands of dollars was wrong, and I regret that I wrote it, and I'm sorry for it, and I've heard your cries, and it's changed me, and I'm a better person for it, and I'm sorry that as a young kid with the enthusiasm of ignorance, I spoke claiming authority on a subject that was much more complex, that was way above my pay grade. And I'm sorry that it played such a huge role and damaged people who I don't know and whom I've never met. It took a lot of courage to do that. You need to have the courage to do that if you're a parent or a youth group leader or a pastor. So that's where healing begins, folks. And that's all I have for you this week. Go Steelers. Last week was a rough one. Hope you're having a good week, and I hope to see you next week. Thanks for joining us.